This is part 2 of a longer interview with Lennie Larkin. I would recommend you go back to part 1 if you haven't heard that one. It's about farm stands, but we talk about Lennie's background and that sets the context for this conversation. This conversation is going to focus on higher level planning out, basically how do we set ourselves up for success in the long term. We're going to talk about it from the standpoint of the very beginner flower farmer who hasn't sold anything yet to a little bit more experienced flower farmers who have had a couple of years under their belts and what it takes to scale to that next level to potentially quit your full-time job to turn that side hustle into a full-time gig. So without further ado, here's the interview. Hi, Lennie. Thank you so much for making the time to join me today to talk about how we can set more flower farms up for success. I feel like that a lot of people know who you are, especially within the past quarter when you've launched this new book that I refer to quite often. I've got like bookmarks in here, but for those of you who don't know who you are, can you give a bit of an introduction about yourself?
I've been farming since 2011 when I moved out to California to do the farm and garden program at UC Santa Cruz. A few years into farming, I was like, screw vegetables. Flowers are the main event here, and flowers just really took over for me. And so I started my own farm around 2014. I moved up to Sonoma County from Santa Cruz in order to start running that vegetable farm I talked about, and then ended up staying for 10 years, and that's where I built my farm. So I was in West Sonoma County. You know, it is sort of wine country, but I was closer to the coast. So it's pretty affluent, but you wouldn't know it all the time. But, you know, the cost of living is so high that I eventually had to move because I couldn't afford to buy land there. I was leasing land. But I started out selling wholesale pretty much, which is ridiculous in California because I've always been a small farm. I've always been under 1 acre. I've leased more land than that, and I started to expand at one point, which we can talk about later, but I always stayed pretty small. And so in California, you're competing with huge farms, like most of the big flower production farms in the US are in California. So here I was, this tiny, dinky farm selling flowers wholesale to these florists who could buy flowers for so much cheaper because they could buy them from these huge farms with much lower costs of production who could afford to sell their flowers for cheaper. So it took me a number of years to realize, like, this isn't a great business model, you know? And so I started out selling wholesale. Then once my floristry skills really got up to speed, I started doing weddings. And I started with small weddings and eventually increased to where my wedding minimum was like $7,000. So doing like big weddings and bringing in like $100,000 a year just from weddings, which was like a little, you know, usually about half of my gross sales or a little bit less than that.
One of the things that you talked about in your book is marketing and getting to know your customer avatar. So I want to see if you could talk a little bit about that, but also from the perspective of starting your farm over, going to Portland. And so what did that process look like for you as you're like, all right, I'm not in Sonoma anymore. This isn't Kansas anymore, right? Like, what's your thought process for going through that?
Yeah. And it's so interesting because, you know, I think it's like common knowledge or common guidance these days is like, learn your target customer, your customer avatar, or your ideal customer, whatever we want to call it. And it is so important, but I think sometimes people are stuck on the details. And if you're stuck on the details, it's okay. Like, there's no magic you're going to uncover by more clearly describing this mythical or real ideal customer. But the idea is really on a basic level to take good notes on the market you're in and who is available to buy your flowers, and then to focus on them. And it's an evolving process, right?
And I guess for the person who is just starting out, like they're kind of in this place where I want to sell flowers, but I don't even know where to start. Where would you advise them to start making these observations and answering these questions?
Yeah, great question. So it's this funny thing because you're trying to learn about your audience or your customers and your marketplace, and you're also trying to figure out your crop plan. But we always tell you not to plant anything until you know who you're selling to, because who you're selling to will dictate what flowers they want to buy. So there it's this like whole chicken and egg situation, and it feels impossible. And the answer is that it's just, you're going to be making incremental gains in all these areas, and it'll start making sense and blending together, and you'll be fine tuning it. But it's like you kind of have to start somewhere. But so I would just, most people these days are growing flowers where they live and where they've lived for a while. So the first thing is to just start viewing your community with a fresh set of eyes. It can sound kind of sinister, like you sort of start looking around and being like, okay, where's the business model here? And I don't want you to like be attaching dollar signs to all your neighbors as you pass them walking your dog in the morning or anything. It's just like, start noticing where people spend money in your community, what the different industries are. I mean, for some, it's really obvious, like you're in a vacation area and lots of weddings happen. So there's florists looking for flowers. Or maybe you're really rural and, maybe there's a strong community around your child's school, around your neighborhood association or whatever. But just start to take note of how and where people spend money, but then also where people spend time, how people communicate, how word spreads in your community. Small towns kind of operate differently than big cities, but it's such an interesting thing I went through in moving up to Portland, because I left Sonoma County really focused on this retail business model. And again, that was evolved. Like I had done all these other things, and then I was focusing on the farm stand. We also did a lot of bouquet deliveries to San Francisco. So, we would charge like $50 a bouquet, maybe sometimes $60 a bouquet, and then another like $25 delivery fee. So similar to florist pricing, and do these kind of big deliveries to San Francisco. We kind of phased out over the last year or so, but it was a big part of our business. So with that and the farm stand, I was like, okay, this 3 times markup, growing fewer flowers, knowing exactly what to grow so that I could be cutting and selling every stem rather than having beds of things that I wasn't even selling. Just being really deliberate about everything and having no waste in the business. I was like, that's what I'm going to do in Portland. I'm going to move my business to Portland and do this retail thing. And then I got up here, and the more I started looking around, and I've lived here before. I lived here 20 years ago. It's not like a new place for me. I started looking around and realizing that flowers sold on the wholesale level here can bring in a little bit more money. So like if I was selling a bunch of zinnias to California florists for $9, I could probably get $11 here. I mean, that, who knows, that I'm sure that's not consistent across the board, but I was seeing just this little increase. Like farmers here can get a little bit more money. And there are reasons for that. The season isn't as long. The growing conditions are a little bit more challenging. It's only really a zone colder, but there are other differences. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that there's not as much money floating around. There's a lot of money. It's not it's of course like diverse economically, but the high end I don't think is as high as Sonoma County. So people aren't walking around looking to spend as much money they were back where I used to live, which made sense why I was able to buy property here, right? But so therefore, I don't think I could get consistently $30 for the kind of bouquets I wanted to make. I think maybe those are more typically sold, that size bouquet, for like $20. So in looking at this, like the bottom, the wholesale markup and then the retail, like I was being crunched from above. Like people wouldn't pay $30, maybe they would pay $20. But also, like, let's say I had to buy in wholesale flowers, I'd have to pay more than I would have otherwise. So the margin is just shrinking. And that made me start thinking, okay, maybe I should think back, or rather revert back to selling wholesale, because you can do it a little bit more easily here. It's not easy. It's highly competitive. All these things, there's great flowers up here already being grown and sold, but like it wasn't as silly a proposition as it was for a small farm in California. And I don't know. So I started rethinking it last year. I ended up joining the wholesale flower market here, the OFGA. I already knew a lot of the farmers around here. They're so wonderful. They're such a great community. And they were sort of like, yeah, join the wholesale market. Like we're all doing really, not like we're all doing great, but everyone's doing pretty well. There's room for growth. It's competitive, but there's room. And moreover, like everyone's excited to see someone growing quality stuff who's not going to undercut them. If you're a good player, they're welcoming to you. So I joined the wholesale market, and I also realized that that's a great way to sell my flowers while we're building up whatever kind of retail business we end up creating. So we're also doing farm dinners, and we're trying to like build sort of this more agritourism thing into our business model. My partner Matt's a chef, and so we did a few farm dinners last year, and we were able to really tease people out to get people come up from Portland and spend a night on the farm having an amazing dinner among the flowers. And that's something we could never really do back when we were leasing land in California. So yeah, it's just a good example of like pushing past your assumptions of what business model you want or you think will work, and then taking a more discerning eye to your potential market, your potential customers, to see what might work where you are. It's a learning process for sure.
It is. And I think a lot of the beginners are always looking for some sort of template or manual, whether it's how do I grow this? What's the manual for that? And then what's the manual for selling? And what you're saying here is that you're literally looking at two different markets, and the two different outlets might actually be better for one versus another, right? So your prior assumptions obviously may not carry over to this new market. And that's just fascinating how it's, I guess, challenged you. So let's talk about now when you work with flower farmers who have a couple of years under their belt. There's this graph, it's called, or the chart, it's called like the Valley of Deaths. And it's a little bit more known in the tech world. It's just that every business at different stages will hit this peak point where they basically plateau, and it's hard for them to get to the next level. So I'm wondering, for your students that you've seen who have had those couple of years under their belt, and what that looks like for me is they have some sales. They're probably doing it by themselves. They're probably having a few sales outlet, and it's nice, right? But they're at this point where they can't quit their full-time job. It's still a side hustle. Like, what do you see as holding them back from getting to the next level so that they can either significantly increase their sales or take that leap of faith to quit their full-time job?
It's such a great question. And I love that you're like, this is a problem I see it, depicted with these graphs, but you're like, I'm also feeling it. Like, it's sort of where I'm in my business right now. I love that. And it's interesting, I've been trying to sort of like map out the different pain points along the journey of growing a flower farm. And, I just finished teaching it was the first year of my flower farming business academy, which was an 8-week course. And it was my like pride and joy. And it did really well. I had a lot of amazing students, so many that I like hired an assistant and did way more Q&As that I thought I was going to do. The feedback I've gotten like really, really incredible feedback from the course, which has just made my day, made my year, because I wanted it to succeed. So I so badly wanted it to succeed, and I so badly wanted to really spend 8 weeks with students and pour over their business models and teach them all these skills and have this community component. But the biggest constructive feedback that I've gotten is that it is really hard to speak to farmers as if they're one group when there's all these different points and all these different pain points we're at as we grow our businesses. So the result for me is that I'm going to split it into 2 different courses, like Flower Farming Business Academy, the 8-week in-depth business course, and then a beginner version, which will probably be a few weeks shorter. It might be the same length, but it'll be really focusing on like when you're just getting started. Maybe at the most experienced, you're just at the point where you're describing, where you start to feel these pain points. So that's what I'm working on for the rest of the year, is like teasing apart my course into 2 different courses, so that the people who are already, getting deep into figuring out their QuickBooks and their email marketing and like having these advanced problems can focus on those, but the people who are just getting started and starting to feel the first signs of growing pains, so they won't be overwhelmed with all that other stuff, and they can focus on what they need to focus on right now. So that's what I'm working on. So I love that you asked about this sort of graph and you brought it up. I think there's a point where you're so used to doing everything yourself and you're sort of maxing out your own time. And for a lot of people, that's 20 or 30 hours a week because you have another career on top of it, and maybe a 1-year-old who keeps you up all night or whatever it is. But or it's your full-time thing, but you're doing it all yourself. And then at the point where you finally have demand for your flowers, so you're still trying to like spread the word, but you do have sales, you do have demand. Maybe your demand is exceeding your production, but you can't quite figure out how to bring someone else into your team. You don't know if you have the money for it. You've never probably never been a manager, so you're like not excited to jump into that role. You probably have some shame around your farm and what it looks like and how good of an experience the employee would be. And therefore, you're sort of like stuck at this sales level. You probably don't have a business plan in place. It's really challenging. So, one thing is that I really, at this point, want people to like take a step back. And usually this can happen over the winter. Take a step back and really look at what business they've created so far and where the pull is, like where the demand is for growth. Like, what my CSA, that's a bad example. I was going to say the example of my CSA is doing so well and people are clamoring for it, but that's usually not the case because CSAs are tricky. Maybe like my sales to wedding florists in my area, there seems to be a demand. People want more than I can provide for them, but I can't physically grow more right now because I'm at capacity. I don't have the time. However, my CSA is sort of like trickling by. I only have like 7 people subscribed. I end up spending so much time on it each week, so much communication with these people. So I want you to take a step back in the winter and say like, what's working and what's really not working, regardless of how much I like it. And if the CSA isn't working, it's time to cut it out. And lean into what's doing well and start evaluating what other sales outlets might work well with the one that is working. And maybe that's a Farmstead, or maybe for someone else that is a CSA. So that's one thing, is just really taking inventory of what's happening and what's working. And then the second thing would be really setting more ambitious sales goals. Like, I'm working with a farmer. I don't do much one-on-one consulting anymore because I prefer to teach in this group setting where people can learn from each other. But I do work with a few farmers one-on-one. And one the other day I said, well, what are your sales goals? And he said, he gave me a really modest number. And he said, I live a simple life. I don't need much. And I was like, great. But I was like, do you have plans for retirement? Do you have money set aside? Have you ever had a serious illness and had to pull money from somewhere else to spend on that? I was like, I think we can aim higher for you. You know what I mean? I don't care if you live a simple life. That's wonderful. But I think we can set a more ambitious goal and then we can work backwards to get there. And I think just starting the process of dreaming bigger, I mean, I'll take one step back. Setting a sales goal at all is a big step. I didn't do it for the first 5 years of my business, I'm sure. I just sold as much as I could, but I didn't know what that was until the end of the year. I want you to start saying how much do I need to live on, or how much do I need to bring in from this job? Is that 60 grand a year? Okay, if I need to net 60 grand a year, I probably need to sell 3 times that amount. I think sometimes people throw around a 50% net margin, net profit, and I think that's unrealistic. I think more 30% is probably realistic once you're looking at hiring help and paying for bookkeeping and paying all your taxes, doing all these things. So if I need to keep 60 grand, I probably need to sell 180 worth of flowers, which is a lot of flowers. But just by starting to set that goal, you train yourself to start thinking bigger and to start being more efficient with your time, cutting your costs, and creating a pathway towards more sales. I could keep going, but I think that those are big ones.
Yeah, and I keep on referring back to your book. You have this one page where you have a sales goal, and now we break it down by crop, by month. And I felt so validated because I did that before your book came out. And then when I read it, I was like, yes, I'm on the right track. But it's definitely one of those things where I think some people might have a sales goal, but they're never working backwards to figure out how to get to it. And then they're not tracking it. So on the topic of tracking sales goals, what do people normally use? Is it an Excel spreadsheet, or are they using a Venmo or whatever it is they're using to capture payment platforms? What would you suggest?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, you probably have sales happening in a bunch of different ways, right? You might be at the point where you're invoicing some customers through QuickBooks or something. You might not be there yet, but if you do, then you have records of those sales. But then you also have, scribbled on a notebook what you brought in from your farm stand that day, because maybe half of it was Venmo, but half of it was cash. So all these different things. So I would recommend creating one place where you're tracking, and I'm not going to get into bookkeeping. I think everyone should start getting bookkeeping help earlier on and probably getting into QuickBooks, quite honestly. But I think setting a goal and then keeping track of your sales, even if it's just by week, in one place. It could be one piece of paper, one Excel spreadsheet, one Google Drive spreadsheet, one Google Doc, one Microsoft Word doc, whatever it is, like one place where week by week you're charting your sales. And, but I would start, like you said, like setting the goal and then dividing that between the weeks of the year and saying, okay, that means I need to sell $1,000 worth of flowers every week to get to where I am. Does that seem reasonable or unreasonable? What were my sales last year? And then what do I need to do to make that weekly sales goal? And that's such an easier task than like saying, okay, what do I need to do to get to 180 grand in sales? Or let's use a more realistic example for a new farmer. What do I need to do to get to 40 grand in sales? Like that's a big proposition if you're just getting started. So instead saying, what do I need to do to get to $500 in weekly sales or whatever it is? Like, okay, my farm stand usually does like $200, but I haven't been investing in it that much. So if I really work on it, I bet I can get my farm stand up to $300. Okay. And then I used to have florist orders like for $50 to $100 a week. But you know what? If I meet with these florists over the winter and ask them what else I could be growing for them or how I could, partner with them in a larger way, how I could support them in a larger way, I bet I could increase my florist orders to $200. Okay, so I'm getting there. I'm getting to that $500 weekly target. And it's just like breaking it down into actionable steps. It's interesting because I think so many new flower farmers are spending a lot of time like thinking through how many successions of sunflowers they need and which flowers they need to pinch and when to switch from the heavy nitrogen fertilizer to the less heavy nitrogen fertilizer. What are all these things that like are important, but I don't think people need to stress and plan over them as much as they do, because I think a lot of these things you're learning as you're going. But where I think more attention to detail is needed is in these sales goals and charting the pathway to get there. So I think the best thing you can do is start tracking when you're planting things and when they bloom, and not being too discouraged if you get away from your plan, but just noting what's happening on the farm when you have the flowers so that you can plan them next year. And then moving away from all that like fretting and that overthinking, and using some of that energy instead to focus on the sales plan.
There's also this assumption that if you build it, they will come. And I think people quickly start realizing, oh, wait, I also need to spend time on marketing. And so for the newer grower, how much time would you advise them to spend on focusing on how do I sell this product?
Yeah, I would suggest that they take 30 minutes a week and decide on like roughly when that's going to be. If it's like Wednesdays at 9 a.m. or Thursdays right after lunch, whatever. And I want them to start setting a goal around how many new eyeballs they're going to get on their business every week. And it could be like, okay, this year, each week, I'm going to reach out to 5 new potential leads. And that might be, a couple of new local businesses that I'm going to connect with on Instagram and say, hey, do you want to do a giveaway together? Or I'd love to bring you some flowers. And not necessarily looking to like do a pop-up at their store or whatever, but just to like get on their radar and start doing some like branding together, some marketing together. I'm going to send an email to 2 different friends each week, asking them to tell 2 other friends about my farm and to let them know of my upcoming pop-up or my farm stand, or to join my mailing list or get on my Instagram. But like just setting these little goals each week really adds up over the long term. And if you're not doing that, 2 months could go by and you're like, ooh, has my reputation, my brand like grown at all in these months? Probably not very much. But if you're just trying to do a few little things every week to grow your following, essentially, and I'm not just talking about social media following, but to grow the awareness of your brand or your flowers, it'll really add up. And especially like as you're just getting started, you're still learning how to grow everything. You're still learning what your business model is going to be. You can take advantage of that time and start building your potential customer base. But it's just about checking in with it every week. So I'd say like a minimum of like half an hour a week. And you can start that half an hour by saying, okay, let me open up my spreadsheet or my clipboard or whatever it is and look at my goal for this week. What is it? Okay, 5 people. I have to reach 5 new people. Okay, how am I going to do that? And just writing a little list for yourself. and then tracking it, like making a bar graph or a pie graph or X's on a whiteboard or whatever it is, and seeing those numbers grow. It's really gratifying. And it reminds you that like there's so much that's out of our control, but this is something that's within our control.
I remember you saying that you had all of these like people icons for your webinar and you were filling them in. And I actually started doing something similar for something different. And it's so gratifying. It's like checking a tick box, except it's better. It's like you actually get to see visually, right? Like how many people you are bringing in. So I feel like that's a little bit of like personal psychology, right? To motivate you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Lennie, you've been so generous with your time. One final question for you is, you've given a lot of advice for the beginner to medium-sized cut flower farmer. If you could have a billboard where you could plaster a piece of advice, what would be on that billboard so that you can get it into everyone's brain about what they need to do to set themselves up for the long term?
Yeah, I love that. Without overthinking it too much, I'm going to go with like first thought, best thought. It might not be the catchiest slogan, but I'm going to say it's all about your time. Like, we only have so many hours in the week, and it's up to us how we spend them in our business. And if we're not careful, we'll spend them weeding a crop that we don't even know if we have sales for that crop yet. Or we'll spend it futzing about the farm, cleaning up the mess we made yesterday. The more you can start realizing that your time is so valuable and it's up to you how you spend it, and that means you're going to devote a certain percentage of it to growing your business, tracking those sales goals, doing the marketing, all these things. It'll make you start to become more efficient in everything you do out in the field. And, talk about lean farming. I mean, lean farming is all about like focusing on the things that add value and cutting out the waste, right? If we're not careful, which we're not in the first few years because we don't know what we're doing, all of our time is just eaten up by the farm. So the more you can start to like be like, every minute I spend is super valuable and I need to treat it that way, and I need to prioritize the things that are growing my business while I'm learning how to farm, you're going to save yourself years and you're going to save yourself from burnout. And I feel personally invested in that because I love that the flower farming bubble is like still expanding, and I want it to continue expanding. And I want our industry to be thriving and filled with incredible small farms all over the country and all over the world. So I don't want people burning out like they have been and like I have been. So it's all about your time.
Great answer. Yeah. Yes, that's a great answer. So where can people find you, Lennie, if they're interested in learning more about you?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Well, yeah, I'm starting to put together the pieces for the new versions of the Flower Farming Business Academy, the advanced one and the beginner one. And my Instagram, Flower Farming for Profit, that's where I'm kind of focusing on the education rather than the B-side farm stuff. And that's sort of it right now. I'm really like excited to get more resources and free information up on my website because not everyone wants to take a big course. Not everyone has money for it. And it's not always necessary. It just depends on what type of learner you are. So I'm hoping to develop more and more resources for people to come read and learn on their own and not spend any money they don't want to spend. So check out my website, get on my newsletter. That's what I'd recommend.
I love your giving heart.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, of course. And you've done a lot of really good interviews. I'm going to put the link to, I think it's like 3 different podcasts that I listened to with you on it. And you shared a lot more information on the business side. So I'll link those in the description. But thank you so much again, Lennie. I'm sure a lot of people will definitely benefit from this conversation.